Hey everyone, I am absolutely stoked to bring this program to you. In it, we're going to be talking about one of the ancient world's greatest empires, one that for a time rivaled the Assyrians and was a formidable foe for the Egyptians. It's an empire and culture that many outside of the world of archaeology and ancient history know little about, because honestly, unless you're from Turkey or the Middle East, you probably never studied it in school. So if you fall into that category, consider yourself lucky, because in this program, we're going to be talking about that empire in question, specifically that of the Hittites and their ancient Anatolian world. First though, let's take a look at this region we call Anatolia. It's one of great physical contrasts, jagged and snowy-capped mountains on one hand and rough, rocky plains on the other. It's not the most hospitable place, and it's a wonder that people could actually live here, but it's true they did. In fact, some of the world's oldest archaeological sites and settlements are from this region, including Çatalhöyük, a site dating back over 10,000 years ago. By around 2000 BC though, it becomes apparent that many settlements started to form. Actually, you could even call them cities because they had relatively large populations of over 15,000 people. Many of them were focused around some type of citadel and in many cases had thick walls. They probably were not as grand as those of Mesopotamia of around the same time period, but they were places where people got together, traded with each other, and formed their own governments. Now this was all during the time period which we call the early Bronze Age. So why would such mountain settlements in arguably the middle of nowhere all of a sudden become important during this time? Well, it's kind of in the name, Bronze Age. As you may or may not know, bronze is made from other metals such as copper and tin, both of which were found in the mountains of Anatolia, and by this time had become extremely valuable commodities. Bronze, and later iron, was used to create strong tools, weapons, plows, and other things that allowed people to become more productive, or to kill each other better. Such metals found in these mountains were extremely coveted by peoples further south, since in the dry deserts, riverbeds, and marshes of Mesopotamia, they were hard to come by. Trading delegations and even merchant colonies were sent to the region from Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world to obtain copper, tin, gold, and silver. This made many of these new mountain cities of Anatolia extremely wealthy, and with wealth comes men of power and ambition. Now, as can be expected, city and later kingdom rivalries arose. Sometime around 1800 BCE, a man named Pitcairn, the ruler of one of these mountain kingdoms called Kusara, also known as Kushar, became ruler of the prosperous city of Kanesh. This city also had an Assyrian merchant colony there, something discussed in another video linked to in the description. Now, as you may be starting to realize, there were a lot of links between ancient Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Pitcairn had an ambitious son named Anida, who really liked the city of Kanesh, so much so that he made it the capital of his kingdom. For reasons unknown, he went to war with his neighbor, the city or kingdom of Hattusa. Well, this kingdom and another one called Zalpa, which was somewhere on the Black Sea. Hattusa was taken after a long siege, which resulted in many of its inhabitants starving to death. After destroying it, he laid a curse on the city, the text of which read, and I quote, "On this site I sowed weeds. May the storm god strike down anyone who becomes king after me and resettles Hattusa." End of quote. Though the documentation from the age is scarce, Anida seems to have bested his rivals and declared himself great king shortly afterwards. Later documents tell of Anida acquiring much gold and silver from a city or kingdom known as Salatiwara. It's possible that it suffered a fate similar to that of Hattusa. Perhaps for this reason, when Anida threatened to attack the wealthy kingdom of Purushanda, its king had the wisdom to voluntarily submit to him. He presented Anida with lavish gifts, including a throne and a scepter of iron, and for this, he was treated honorably. So it seems like if you played by Anida's rules and submitted to him, both your life and your city were spared. Now, there are many in the scholarly community who say that Anita was the first king of the Hittites. Others give that title to someone else, who we'll discuss shortly. He is, though, the first king that we know about to commission a document in the original Hittite language, known as Nesite. The truly original name for that document is the Anitta text. Though a bit biased, the text is a good source for the life of this early Anatolian king. It's also the first text that we have in any Indo-European language. Unfortunately for his descendants, the empire which Anitta founded dissolved with his death, sometime around the year 1740 BCE. So let's step back for a moment and take a quick look at the world outside of Anatolia for some context and perspective. For the most part, the ancient Near East had been dominated during the past few centuries by the likes of great powers for quite some time. You first had the empire of Sargon the Great and later his grandson, Naram Sin. After a short dark interlude, you had the prosperous and enlightened Neo-Sumerian Empire. At least, that's the way it's been depicted in many texts. Even when this collapsed, it resulted in successor states that eventually held great power and wealth. To put it succinctly, Mesopotamia had access to wealth and trade, and the kings of Anatolia wanted a piece of that action. There was only so much that could be attained from living in a rocky periphery with few good areas to farm, which was essentially what their land in Anatolia consisted of. Though Anitta had laid a curse on Hattusa, that doesn't seem to have stopped others from resettling the city. About 100 years after he destroyed it, Hattusa was not only reoccupied, but rebuilt. This could have been due to its original advantage of sitting high atop a rocky plateau, making it the prime place for a citadel. It also kept it at a safe distance from hostile tribes to the north, as well as relatively close to all of the action that was going on in ancient Mesopotamia at the time. All of these may have prompted a local chieftain or prince to take his chances with Anitta's curse and make Hattusa his capital. He himself took the name Hattushili, meaning man of Hattusa. Now, was Hattushili related to Anitta? Maybe, but honestly there's been no conclusive proof of this. His father is actually listed in the Hittite chronologies as Labarna. So Labarna is considered to be the first of the Hittite line, or dynasty as we'll call it. Without a doubt though, Hattushili was one of the greatest kings of that line, and he is often regarded as the founder of the Hittite Old Kingdom. There seems to be no doubt that Hattushili had great ambitions for his kingdom, but first, he had to deal with consolidating his power and putting down rebellions at home. It was after this that he established a new capital for himself atop the ruins of Hattusa and took the lion as his symbol, something that would remain a motif or a symbol of the Hittites for years to come. After securing his kingdom, at least for the time being, Hattushili engaged in his goal to get his share of Mesopotamia's wealth. He assembled and marched a great army southeast towards what is today northern Syria. Here was the powerful Amorite kingdom of Yamhad, with its capital at Halab, today modern-day Aleppo. Knowing that he probably didn't have the manpower nor the ability to mount a successful direct attack on Halab, he instead chose to attack another city of Yamhad called Alak. In this he was successful, and he more or less destroyed Alak. This may have been foolish because Alak was a great trade center, but destroying it definitely gave him unopposed access to the Mediterranean Sea. It also meant that he didn't have to spend necessary resources and manpower to administer what would have no doubt been a restive and rebellious population. His stay in the south, though, was short because news reached him that his Anatolian rival, the kingdom of Arzawa, was invading his territories from the west. Now, we don't know much about Arzawa or even its exact borders, only that it's mentioned in Hittite texts. What we do know is that Hattushili was successful in neutralizing the Arzawan threat, and afterward, he once again returned to his obsession with conquering Yamhad and taking over all of northern Syria. However, this was not to be. Hattushili would die before he could resume his plans, a very fortunate circumstance for Yamhad. The story of Hattushili's death, though, is worth mentioning. Before his final passing, he had gathered around him the leading men of the kingdom in order to inform them of his successor. They all met at his ancestral home, the city of Kushara. Hattushili was on his deathbed, and exactly what happened is a mystery, but it seems that he was betrayed first by his sons, then his nephew, and perhaps even by one of his daughters, all of whom were in contest to obtain his throne. Well, not the daughter, since the Hittites didn't have queens. Her reason for betrayal isn't exactly clear. As his successor, Hattusili chose his grandson, Murshili, who was then just a minor, probably in his late teens. What would happen, though, to Hattusili's now growing and expanding empire? Would the old kingdom dissolve, just like Anita's did a century before? With the betrayals of Hattusili's sons and daughters, along with Murshili's inexperience and young age, a betting man would say the empire would most likely dissolve. Of course, history is full of surprises, Hittite history being no different. When Murshili ascended the Hittite throne, he was probably just in his teens. He had little, if any, experience in both matters of state or as a warrior. Despite his age, Murshili either had extremely capable commanders, was innately a great leader, or just had a lot of luck. Perhaps it was all three. He resumed his attack on Yamhad to finish what his grandfather, Hattusili I, had started. His attacks on what remained of Yamhad, mainly Aleppo and Karkemish, were relentless. Finally, some say in 1600, others say in 1595, Murshili captured and destroyed Aleppo. Yes, the once powerful Amorite kingdom that during its height under Yerim Lim was possibly the most powerful state in the world, at least politically, was now in ruin. Only the city of Karkemish defied Murshili's full control. Though not being able to penetrate its walls, he had it totally surrounded. Besides, it wasn't going anywhere. He could starve it out if he had to. As for Yamhad's king, Hammurabi III, we're simply told that he was captured and, quote, made atonement to Murshili. So, let's get into the mind of this relatively young king. He was not destined to be king. He was made so by his grandfather when another should have taken his place. He comes of age and realizes that he has all the resources of the Hittite state to back him. He rules unchallenged for several years and then decides to finish what his grandfather started, conquering all of Yamhad. He does this, sacking Aleppo and taking its great wealth, which can ultimately be used to replenish his old army and essentially buy a new one. Now, all of these things also indicate that the gods must favor you. How else could one be so successful? You then hear that the fabled kingdom of Babylon, the Babylon and Babylonian empire that Hammurabi built, is weak. So if you were in Murshili's place, what would you do? Would you go so far to the east and attack Babylon? Most, I think, would say that it's an overambitious, if not foolish venture, especially for a band of Hittites from Anatolia, venturing into a land they knew little about. Murshili, though, decided to maintain the momentum of his successes and march southeast along the Euphrates, into the heart of Mesopotamia itself and to Babylon. During that same year he conquered Yamhad, at least according to the Babylonian chronicles, namely 1595 BCE, he reached the city of Babylon, attacked it, and captured it. The details of just how he did this are scarce. In a later Hittite document known as the Proclamation of Telepinu, we are simply told, and I quote, "He, Murshili I, marched to Aleppo, and destroyed Aleppo and brought captives and possessions of Aleppo to Hattusa. Then, however, he marched to Babylon, and he destroyed Babylon, and he defeated the Hurrian troops, and brought captives and possessions of Babylon to Hattusa." End of quote. Hattusa was the Hittite capital in Anatolia. Now, as powerful as he might have been, it's likely that Murshili's Hittite forces had some help from what were Babylon's many local enemies at the time, including a group of people originally from the Zagros Mountains, known as the Kassites. Pay attention to that name, the Kassites, because they would later go on to rule Babylonia for at least 400 years. So why did Murshili go to Babylon in the first place? As mentioned earlier, he was a young king who probably thought that his protection from the gods made him invincible. But more than that, Babylon, though not the same power as when Hammurabi ruled it, was still an extremely wealthy city. Plus, Murshili would get a lot of prestige by conquering it. His name would be remembered, and the Hittites would be both feared and respected as a major power in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East. Now, maybe Mushili did want to stay in Babylon. It was probably considered to be in those days the most beautiful city in the world, although it's possible that Memphis or Thebes could have also held that same title. It's hard to compare, but it was probably much better than Hattusa. Speaking of which, there was some trouble on the home front. With Mushili being gone for so long, fighting in northern Syria and conquering Babylonia, members of the Hittite royal family were plotting against him. When he got news of this, he hastily had to abandon his new Babylonian prize and head back home. After all, he was first the king of the Hittites, not of the Babylonians. Besides, he probably couldn't hold on to Babylon for long anyway. Mushili had spread himself a bit thin and didn't have the manpower nor the administrative resources to keep the lands that he had conquered in Mesopotamia. As the Hittites left, the Kassites came in, and as mentioned before, Babylonia was ruled by them for the next 400 years. Upon his return home, Mushili was assassinated and then succeeded by his brother-in-law, Khantili. This though caused tremendous instability, and the following years were filled with coups and possibly more assassinations of royal family members. In a nutshell, his successors, Zidanta, Amuna, and Kuzia, were weak rulers, and the once powerful Hittite state began to lose a lot of its territory and prestige in Anatolia. Nearly all of the Syrian domains that the Hittites had conquered evaporated, and their once great but subdued western Anatolian rival, the Arzawa, gained their independence. A tribal people north of Hattusa called the Kashka were raiding and plundering Hittite towns and cities. A document claims that at one point, the Kashka were only a few kilometers away from the Hittite capital of Hattusa. The kingdom was a mess, so all that work that Hattushili and Mursili put into obtaining a vast kingdom for the Hittites, not to mention the destruction of both Yamhad and Babylonia, were pretty much all in vain, all for nothing. In the end, little if anything substantial had come from it. Now things did get a little better around 1500 BCE with the ascension of Telepinu to the Hittite throne. Though he can't really be described as a great conqueror, what Telepinu did was to consolidate the lands already within his kingdom, essentially preventing them from slipping away. Not a fan of unnecessary armed conflict, Telepinu also created many alliances with his neighbors. Probably the most for the survival of his dynasty, he created a proper system for royal succession so that every time a king died, there was less chance of infighting and assassinations between various claimants for the throne. For a while, all of these seemed to have worked, as they gave the Hittite kingdom valuable time in recovering from all of the chaos of the past few decades. Unfortunately, after Telepinu's death, his successors seem to have done away with basically everything that he had accomplished domestically. The next 50 or so years were ones of stagnation, overall decline, and of course, weak rulers who for the most part weren't in power for very long. Around the year 1450 BCE, we don't know the exact date, but a king by the name of Tudhaliya I took over the Hittite throne. It turns out though that the beginning of his reign was quite troublesome, or at least there were troublesome events. One, a relatively new power, the Mitanni, were on the up. Two, that new power, the Mitanni, pretty much destroyed or took over other kingdoms that were once Hittite allies. There was really no doubt in anyone's mind. The Mitanni were coming for Hattusa, and Tudhaliya had to be ready. To test Tudhaliya, the Mitanni decided to inspire revolts in Hittite-held cities. One of these was a city called Ishua on the Euphrates River. Fortunately, Tudhaliya's troops were able to regain control of the situation and the city, but it proved a point that the Mitanni had their eyes on his kingdom. These campaigns with the Arzawa diverted them several times from their greater goals of conquering Yamhad and other lands to their southwest. Tudhaliya, though, seems to have learned from his ancestors' history with these people and prepared for an Arzawa attack from the west. When it came, he was able to crush it, which not only pacified his western borders, but when news reached the Mitanni of his victory, they decided to also stay put. Tudhaliya apparently had the gods on his side, so in Mitanni eyes, it was best not to provoke him, or at least not yet, after such a resounding victory. This, though, would not be the last time that the Mitanni would provoke the Hittites. Tudhaliya, though, was developing a reputation not just in the region, but internationally. This is probably what inclined the Egyptians to make a treaty of friendship with the Hittites during his reign. Perhaps the Egyptian pharaoh knew that eventually their armies would meet in battle, because shortly afterward, Tudhaliya launched a campaign into Syria. This time, the city of Halab, aka Aleppo, surrendered more or less without a fight and accepted Hittite sovereignty over what was once the great kingdom of Yamhad. With more wealth and resources under his belt, Tudhaliya launched a campaign north of Syria and into Mitanni territory. In this, he was also victorious. Though not completely destroyed, the Mitanni were pacified for the foreseeable future. Like his ancestor Murshili I before him, Tudhaliya also seemed to have the favor of the gods. Well, maybe not. You see, soon after all of this, Tudhaliya died. His son Arnuwanda took power in 1420 BCE. Perhaps he, though, wasn't as feared as his father, because renewed problems with the Kashka people of the north emerged, to the point that they were strong enough to plunder many Hittite shrine cities. The Mitanni were also once again causing problems by obtaining allegiances from Tudhaliya's former allies. Not only this, but as had occurred many times in the past, plots to assassinate the king were revealing themselves, making Arnuwanda extremely paranoid. From all of this, it seems clear that Arnuwanda was not respected nor feared like his capable father. Arnuwanda's son, Tudhaliya II, seemed to fare no better and suffered attacks from nearly all directions. The Kashka to the north, the Arzawa to the west, and again, the Mitanni to the east. Things got so bad that eventually even the capital of Hattusa was captured and burned to the ground. That, though, is at least what Hittite records say. When archaeologists surveyed the area, they found no trace of destruction by fire to match the timing of the event, so there's debate as to whether or not this actually happened. To be honest, though, whether or not the city burned to the ground is a moot point. What was certain is that Hittite fortunes had clearly reversed. For example, the king of Arzawa was now proclaiming himself to be the master of Anatolia and attempted to forge his own alliance with Egypt through marriage. For all practical purposes, the Hittites were no longer a power to be reckoned with. The wonderful thing, though, about history is that, like in any story, anything can happen. Though he had been defeated on many occasions, Tudhaliya II had not been captured, nor had he died. Strangely enough, he wasn't assassinated, a fate that many of his previous ancestors had suffered in the past. Probably his greatest blessing, though, was his son, Shupil-u-Liuma. I will admit, that is a very difficult name for me to pronounce. It is a name, though, that history should remember. Now, this is what historians have essentially concluded from all of the evidence that's available. It seems that at this time, father and son, along with the main Hittite army, were camping out in the highlands of Anatolia, waiting for the right time to make their comeback. This kind of reminds me of King Alfred of Wessex, when he was camped out in the Somerset marshes, evading the Danes who had all but conquered his kingdom. It was definitely a tough and trying time for the Hittite king. Now, before he passed away around 1380 BCE, Tudhaliya II and Shupil-u-Liuma launched an attack against the king of the Mitanni, Tushratta, which actually ended in a complete failure. To show his power, Tushratta sent some of the spoils of war to his new ally, the Pharaoh of Egypt. Tudhaliya and his sons, Shupil-u-Liuma and another son named Tudhaliya, who we'll call Tudhaliya Jr., went with whatever remained of the Hittite army and ventured to the north of Hattusa. There, they fought against and had much better luck against the northern tribes, including the Kashka. It was in these campaigns that Shupilluliuma proved himself to be a great warrior. When Tudhaliya II died, Tudhaliya Jr. became Tudhaliya III. Now, for whatever reason, the officers of the Hittite army did not support Tudhaliya, and in a coup, killed him and gave the crown to Shupilluliuma. Now, as unethical as this may have been, it might have ultimately proved to have been the right thing for what remained of the Hittite kingdom at the time. Shupilluliuma's first priority was to take back the lands that had been seized by his enemies. For 20 years, he battled in campaign after campaign against the Kashka and the other tribes in the north, as well as the Arzawa in the west. He fought what must have initially been guerrilla campaigns, but with each victory, Shupilluliuma was able to rally more people and fighting men to his cause. He was acquiring quite a reputation, not only as a great warrior, but also as a great leader. By around 1340 BCE, he had defeated his enemies as well as taken back the old Hittite lands to the north and the west. Hattusa was also his once again. However, he still had to deal with the Mitanni to the east. They could actually destroy everything that he had worked for these past 20 to 25 years. It turns out, though, that the geopolitical situation at the time favored Shupilluliuma. Egypt was now being ruled by the so-called heretic king, Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten. This was a king who in a sense established a monotheistic religion where he rejected all of Egypt's many gods and worshipped only Aten, the god associated with the sun. Fully focused on his god, his gaze turned away from his Mitanni and Syrian allies. Thus, the Mitanni king Tushratta more or less lost his most powerful ally. Domestically, Tushratta had challenges as well as rival claimants to his throne. Now, Shupilluliuma had a sort of personal grudge against Tushratta, and seemed to be willing to do anything to hurt his great enemy. Thus, he allied himself with many of these rival claimants. He made the following proposal. They did not have to swear fealty to him and become his allies, but they must not interfere with his mounting war with Tushratta. It seems that they obeyed his wishes, because Shupilluliuma was able to venture deep into Mitanni territory that took him through Syria and possibly as far south as the mountains of northern Lebanon. Now, perhaps thinking that the Hittite king had ventured too far into his own turf, which also may have given him an advantage, Tushratta attacked. Shupilluliuma, though, was able to defeat him, and Tushratta was forced to withdraw further back into northern Syria. Shupilluliuma spent the next year harassing Tushratta's forces all over Syria. At one point, Shupilluliuma even made it to the Mitanni capital of Washkukani and conquered it. Tushratta and whatever forces he had left were now on the run. Defeating the Mitanni also opened up northern Syria and the kingdoms of Halab, Alak, Kadesh, and Amuru, all which now fell into the Hittite sphere of influence. The conquest of these wealthy states gave Shupilluliuma greater abilities to both mop up what was left of the Mitanni kingdom as well as attack Egyptian territories to the south. There was, though, one Syrian state that still opposed the Hittites, Carchemish. Not only had Carchemish remained independent, but the city was also still allied with the Mitanni. The timing was also bad for Shupilluliuma because he had to return to the Hittite homeland for other matters. In his place, he dispatched his son, Telipinu, to take out the troublesome kingdom. While Telipinu was able to take the areas surrounding it, he could not get the city of Carchemish itself to surrender. Eventually, the Mitanni were able to launch a counterattack, which repelled Telipinu from the area. The situation in newly acquired Kadesh was also tenuous, as Egyptian forces attacked there. These two problems forced Shupilluliuma to act or else lose all that he had gained in Syria. He relieved his son Telipinu from taking Carchemish and instead sent him to deal with the Egyptians at Kadesh. Shupilluliuma decided that he himself would take Carchemish once and for all. Again, though, geopolitical events seem to have fallen in favor of Shupilululiuma. His two main enemies, the Mitanni and the Egyptians, were going through internal problems of their own. Tushratta, Shupilululiuma's main nemesis, was assassinated, and a dynastic struggle for the Mitanni throne went into full swing. This also forced the Mitanni to abandon their defense of Carchemish. Shortly after this, the city fell to the Hittites. So around this time also a really strange thing happened. So strange and really just out of the ordinary that many scholars even doubt that it even occurred. It's kind of something right out of a soap opera or a telenovela. The young pharaoh of Egypt, Tutankhamun, had just died without leaving an heir. Shupilululiuma received a letter from his widow. What she wrote in this particular letter was truly stunning, and I quote, "My husband has died. I have no sons. They say you have many sons. If you were to give me one of your sons, he would become my husband. I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid." End of quote. The rumor was that Tutankhamun's widow was to now marry her Grand Vizier, a man named Ai, who some speculate may have even been her grandfather. Regardless of the relation, she was a queen, and in her mind, it was beneath her to marry the vizier, someone who was technically her servant. Thus, out of pride, she appealed to Shupilululiuma for a marriage to one of his sons. This would have made the son, a Hittite, pharaoh of Egypt. Though Egyptians generally viewed foreigners as inferior to them, Shupilululiuma's sons were obviously of royal blood, and so fit her requirement as a possible suitor and not a servant. This for Shupilululiuma was an incredible offer. So incredible, in fact, that he honestly didn't believe it. His son, the future Mushili II, recalls the incident, and I quote, "When my father heard this, he called the great ones into council and said, 'Nothing like this has ever happened to me before.'" End of quote. Shupilululiuma thought this was a trick and dispatched one of his men to confirm that if indeed the situation in Egypt and the events described were actually true. Shortly afterward, he received another letter from the Egyptian queen. In this new letter, she seemed to be a little ticked off. She says, and I quote, "Why do you say they are playing tricks on me like that? If I had a son, would I have written to a foreign land about my son and my country's humiliation? You did not believe me, and have actually spoken like that to me. I have not written to any other country. I have only written to you. Give me one of your sons. He will be my husband, and in Egypt he will be king." End of quote. Shupilululiuma took this as confirmation and sent one of his sons southward to Egypt. He couldn't give up on the possibility of his son, and by extension himself, becoming the ruler of Egypt. But on the way, his son died under mysterious circumstances, most likely by Egyptians who were trying to prevent a foreigner, one with whom there had actually been conflict with in the past, and who was also seen as inferior to them, become the next pharaoh of Egypt. Sometime during the early 1300s BCE, the Hittites and the Egyptians met in battle somewhere in Canaan. The Hittites were victorious and took many prisoners. It was an astounding victory to say the least, but it came with a huge cost. The prisoners brought back a plague into Hittite territory, ultimately claiming the life of both Shupilululiuma and his successor, Arnuwanda II. Thus was the death of one of the greatest Hittite kings of all time. Without Shupilululiuma, the Hittite kingdom may have never survived, let alone thrived. Later Hittite kings would build upon the strong foundation which Shupilululiuma had created. Luckily for him though, he had many sons. The one who succeeded him became Mushili II. With the help of his brother, Mushili was able to hold on to Syria without much trouble, and so he decided to head back to Anatolia and further Hittite domains there. Besides, there were scores to settle with traditional enemies and troublemakers. One of these was the Kashka, who occupied the regions just north of the Hittite capital of Hattusa. After pacifying them yet again, Mushili II turned his gaze west towards the Arzawa. Now this kingdom and the region in general had always been a perennial threat to Hittite ambitions. Nearly every time the Hittites would venture south to Syria or to the frontiers of Mesopotamia, the Arzawa would strike the Hittite state from the west. To put an end to them and their troublesome allies once and for all, Mushili launched a punitive campaign that lasted about 2 years. When it was all over, Arzawa firmly became a Hittite territory, and Mushili's growing empire now reached the Aegean Sea. This, along with the territories north of Hattusa, made Mushili the master of Anatolia. The Egyptians, though, had not forgotten about their defeat in Canaan and inspired revolts in Carchemish. Mushili's brother was not able to quell these due to falling ill and dying unexpectedly. In the end, order was restored, and Mushili II's nephew was put in charge of Carchemish. For the time being, Mushili's territories were secure. He died a very happy king. So as we've seen in the past, the Egyptians and the Hittites didn't always have the most fruitful relationship. With ambitious leaders on both sides, war was bound to occur, and it often did. This came with the ascension of Mushili II's son, Muwatalli II. To help better govern his empire and remain closer to the action in Syria, Muwatalli moved the Hittite capital from Hattusa to the city of Tarkuntasha. Now, during this time in history, Egypt was ruled by one of its most famous pharaohs, Ramses II. He was determined not only to just avenge past Egyptian defeats, but to further expand Egypt's influence into Palestine and the Levant. Ramses attacked the Hittite border near the town of Kadesh, and the two sides fought a battle which most scholars agree was a military stalemate. However, the outcome forced Ramses to withdraw Egyptian forces from the area. Thus, Syria was firmly within the Hittite sphere of influence. Though successful in the war with Egypt, the Hittites were unable to prevent what was going on in the Mitanni lands that technically were under their rule. The once proud Mitanni had become a Hittite vassal under Tushrata's son. With the Hittites, though, focused on their border war with the Egyptians, they were caught by surprise when a new, more powerful adversary reared its head. These were the Assyrians, and like the Hittites, they were an expansionist, warrior society with ambitions of their own to rule the entire Middle East. Now, in the past, there had been bad blood between both the Assyrians and the Mitanni. The Assyrians actually were once vassals of the Mitanni. Things, though, had changed, with the Mitanni becoming weaker and the Assyrians becoming much more powerful. In fact, things had changed so much that the Assyrians marched into Mitanni lands virtually unopposed and made it a vassal of Assyria. At the time, there was little that Muwatalli could do. The death of Muwatalli II brought his son, Mushili III, to power. While the transition of power was initially peaceful, Mushili was generally paranoid that he would lose his position as king. One of the people Mushili seems to have been afraid of was his uncle, Hattushili. Being the governor of the empire's northern frontier, the area where the Kashka often caused trouble, Hattushili was quite the capable administrator and military tactician. He absolutely resented being told what to do or how to govern by a young king with little real experience. After 7 years or so, Hattushili got fed up with his nephew and deposed him. Thus, he became Hattushili III. So, I suppose Mushili III was right to be paranoid, though arguably he himself was the cause of his own loss of power. Now, one of the first things that Hattushili III did was to move the Hittite capital back to Hattusa. He probably did this because it was closer to his old power base, the area to the north where he used to govern. More than a warrior, he's better known as being a shrewd statesman. Not only did he reaffirm and realign alliances, but he also was skilled at playing the Assyrians and the Egyptians off of each other, all while maintaining Hittite influence in the region. Things, though, got a lot more dangerous when the Mitanni king, who was technically an Assyrian vassal, rebelled against his overlords. One thing about the Assyrians you should know: they didn't mess around. They were able to crush the revolt of the Mitanni king. Instead of appointing a new king as their vassal, the Assyrians created a new province with the Mitanni lands and installed their own governor. This was a game changer. No longer was there a sphere of influence or a vassal in between them. Now, the Assyrians officially shared a border with the Hittites. Hattusili needed allies. He wrote to the Kassite king of Babylonia, Kadashman Turgu, and proposed that they form an alliance. This was concluded between the two kingdoms, but when Kadashman Turgu died, his successor, Kadashman Enlil II, terminated the alliance, perhaps due to pressure from the Assyrians. When you think about it, it was a pretty practical move and made sense. The Hittite Empire was relatively far from Babylon, while the Assyrians were just north and posed a much more formidable threat to Babylonian independence. Needing allies, Hattusili did the unthinkable. He initiated peace with the Egyptians and concluded a treaty with them. Hattusili even gave his daughter in marriage to the Egyptian pharaoh. That pharaoh, I might add, was Ramses II. It's pretty incredible that two bitter rivals became allies. The great Hattusili passed on, and his son, Tudhaliya IV, took his place. Now, in short, this was the beginning of the end of the Hittite Empire. Tudhaliya tried to rule as his father had, maintaining good relations with Egypt and avoiding an all-out war with Assyria. He placed economic sanctions on Assyria, preventing them from trading with his vassals in the Levant and the greater Mediterranean. This, though, failed, and soon armed conflict broke out. The Assyrians bested Tudhaliya's forces, and the king and his men were forced to return back to Hittite territory in disgrace. Then his cousin, Kurunta, who was the governor of the old, temporary capital of Tarkuntasha, rose up in rebellion, captured the current capital of Hattusa, and set it on fire. Kurunta then declared himself king, though eventually Tudhaliya was able to overpower him and take back the throne. Regardless, though, both of these events had severely weakened his position and stature as king. Add to this the perennial rabble-rousing of the Kashga in the north and the Arzawa to the west, and a new round of chaos went into full swing. The one success that Tudhaliya did have was that he was able to conquer the island of Cyprus and secure its rich copper supplies. Also, Tudhaliya went on a large building spree in Hattusa, which indicates that despite political troubles and enemies all around, the Hittite treasury was still in good shape. Tudhaliya IV was succeeded by his son, Arnuwanda III, but he died after a short time in office. Another son, Shupilluliuma II, then took the throne. Under him, things went from bad to worse. The provinces were restless, and Hittite authority was increasingly growing weak outside of the areas around Hattusa. However, the biggest threat to the empire wasn't the Assyrians, a resurgent Mitanni, or even a renewed conflict with Egypt. Historians actually believe that the main culprit was climate change. Rising temperatures and decreasing rainfall led to failing harvests and the reliance of grain from areas outside of Hittite control, specifically Canaan and Egypt. Then, a great movement of peoples, who historians simply call the Sea Peoples, swarmed through the famine-ridden lands, causing chaos and ultimately leading to the breakdown of law and order not just in Anatolia, but Syria, the Levant, Canaan, and other places. The Egyptians were also affected, but they seem to have been able to weather the storm much better than others. Who these sea people were is not 100% for certain, though many scholars believe that they probably came from the Aegean and were migrating eastward to escape famine in their own lands. We just know that this swarm of migrants caused havoc for the Hittites, who were unable to control them or do much to stop their advances. With Hittite authority broken in almost all areas, the various provinces, towns, and cities were left to fend for themselves. Some declared independence, others simply lived in anarchy, doing whatever they could to live through the famine. Again, it wasn't just the Hittites who were affected. Their enemies, such as the Arzawa, Mitanni, and the rebellious city-states in Syria, such as Carchemish and Halab, suffered in much the same way, and in many cases, even worse. The calamity affecting the region emboldened the Kashga people to mount one last offensive on Hattusa. In this, they were successful. They captured the great Hittite city and put it to the torch. It's not known exactly when or how Shupilluliuma II died, but it was likely between the years 1180 to 1176 BCE. Thus ended the empire of the Hittites. They were a powerful people while they lasted, though they didn't have the longevity or the continuity as a people or culture as, say, the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and the other great powers of the region. What had once been the Hittite Empire afterward disintegrated into smaller, petty kingdoms. These little Neo-Hittite states, as we'll call them, were later absorbed into the empires of others, most notably the Assyrians. That, though, is a story for another program, at another time. Thanks so much for stopping by the channel. If you learned something, please like the video and subscribe to the channel because it really helps out a lot. In addition, you can follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks again, and hopefully I'll run into you soon.